name is Alan Amy, and I'm going to be presenting this morning, creating the Harmonious Classroom, a return to calm. I just want to say what a great opportunity it was to really feel that rush of anxiety this morning. It's better than coffee. One of the things I'm so grateful to Beline, my co-host in this meeting, because I shared with her when we spoke way back when, it took me so long to learn Zoom, right? I'm not a technological guy. And so then the Cisco WebEx is a new learning system for me. And this morning I'm probably not doing something technologically correct. And so I got to feel what it must feel like for certain students in the classroom, that rush of anxiety where literally I just shut down. And I'm so grateful to Beline for being here, and I want to welcome you all. So that's a great place to start. So Beline, if you could hit the next slide, and I'm just going to be talking through this presentation. I wanted to start off the meeting this morning with a story that everyone seems to know, or a lot of educators know. It's called the Starfish Story. If you're not familiar with it, I'll just briefly summarize it. It's basically a little girl walks onto the beach one morning and sees the beach literally littered with thousands and thousands of starfish. They are all over the beach. And she starts to methodically pick up a starfish, plunk it back into the ocean, pick up another starfish, drop it back into the ocean. And she continues doing this for a while, one starfish at a time. Later on in the morning, an older gentleman happens to walk onto the beach. He sees this little girl doing this, and he says to her, "Little girl, what are you doing? Can't you see there's just thousands of starfish? There's just too many. You'll never be able to make a difference." And then the little girl calmly picks up a starfish, drops it into the ocean, and says, "Well, I did with that one." And that's a story that I've heard as an educator many times, and I'm sure a lot of educators have heard that story. And I started to think about, what if that little girl on the beach wasn't your typical neurotypical child? And Beline, if you could hit the slide. And I'm going to actually, while I'm talking to you, Beline, I'm going to have my slides up here as well, just so I can see them. Thank you. So I'm just going to throw up my slides so I can see them as well. So if that little girl had some struggles with sensory integration, maybe pragmatics, understanding languaging, social cues, that story might not have ended the same. Maybe she would have responded in a different way with some emotion to her voice, or maybe defiance, or maybe ran off and not listened to the little man, the man. And basically that little girl, there would have been a different ending to the story. So one of the things that I'm hoping to do in this presentation is talk about how we can be empathetic educators and maybe not present as the man in that story, knowing that not all children respond in the same way. If you want to hit the slide again to a different ending. Thank you so much. And if you want to hit the next slide, Beline, I'm sorry, we'll get the hang of this. Okay, so I want to share a little bit about a starfish story that's real, because I know the starfish story itself is fiction, but it's based in some reality. A school that I visited had a young boy in kindergarten, and this young boy would be in fight or flight and literally run out of the classroom numerous times. And I guess the school's choice of dealing with this matter was to try to block the kindergarten door. And one day, this little boy made it past whoever it was, the custodian, the teacher, whoever was there trying to block his way, and was in such fight or flight that he literally tried to scale a 20-foot chain link fence. And up he went, and thank goodness the custodian was good at climbing, and he got up and kind of was able to calmly talk this young boy down. And that's what we're dealing with some of our children in the classroom, the sense of anxiety that they have, that it really is, it's so important for us as educators to find ways to create a safe and harmonious classroom. If you can hit the next slide, I believe that'd be great. I just want to say a little bit about myself. So again, my name is Alan Amy. I have 25 years of classroom experience. I've worked as an autism support specialist here in Los Angeles, a social emotional learning facilitator, um, and most importantly, I am also a father to a child on the autism spectrum. And that's a lot of what I'm going to address today in the classroom. One of the things that I do, you can see to the left, I'm also a writer. I've written 2 plays about autism and public education that I take across the country to college settings to speak with young students who are learning to be educators. I also work for the Miracle Project as a social coach, and I included that note that you can see from my son. My dad is jerky, but sometimes nice. Just so you know that I am still figuring this out as I go along. If you could hit the next slide, Lee, that would be great. So as we're sitting here, it's a Saturday morning, and I'm sure everyone is learning so much, and there might even be a sense of overload to all that we're learning. I was thinking what I'm hoping that the people attending today could listen to is from a place of how can I not only learn for myself in my classroom, in my resource room, in my gen ed classroom, but also how can I advocate for my entire student community? How can I support my peers and colleagues? And so if we can listen from that place, there might be a lot of what you hear is like, oh, I know that, I know that. But there might be something that you hear that you might want to share with a colleague or a peer from another school, or just maybe a certain student, like, oh, this would be approach to be helpful for that student. So hopefully there's something that you'll hear today that can be useful for a colleague, for yourself, a student. And that's what I'm hoping that we can listen from today. Beline, can you hit the slide, please? So just to that effect, if the chat is open, if you have questions or comments, Beline had offered to help me with that because, as I mentioned, a little bit technologically impaired. So, I'm sorry, Beline, I'm looking at it different. Could you go back? I apologize. I'm making this very difficult for you. I'm sorry. Listening from, and then the next slide. Thank you. Right there. Yes, I'm sorry. So I'm looking at slides on my own desktop. So the chat button is there. If you have questions, if you have comments, Belina is actually doing double work now. She's sharing screen for me, which I so appreciate, and checking chats. But if you do, please put in, and we'll both look for those. The 4 areas that I'm hoping to address today for Starfish, if you will: knowledge and understanding, supportive environments, nurturing educators, and SEL practices. So those are just 4 areas. There's so much more to cover into SEL practice and interventions, so much more that I can cover. But I was just hoping to start with those 4 areas and hopefully we can find some things that are of use today. So next slide, if we can just start with knowledge and understanding. We're going to talk a little bit about autism, about neurodiversity, because I think before we can really put in practice into place, we have to understand the why of certain things. And I think it's really important for educators to understand a little bit more about neurodiversity, autism, and ASD, autism spectrum disorder. So, Belina, if you could hit the next slide, please. Thank you. Um, so another story, I'm going to be talking about different stories from classrooms that I've visited over the years that I think are really useful as real life scenarios. So this was a classroom that I was visiting. It was a brand new Aut Core teacher and really wanting to do a good job. She had some one-on-ones in her classroom, BIs, and there was a K through, I think, up to 3rd grade classroom. And I think there was about 6 children, and she was doing a slideshow on occupations. And I guess there was one child there that they were working with on some self-control, physical self-control, whatnot, and who was nonverbal. And when she happened to show a slide about a lifeguard, this child started to what looked like flail their hands, kind of rapidly flailing their hands. And this teacher, well-meaning, well-intentioned, signaled for the BI to come to hold this child's arms down by their side. and there was quite a struggle that ensued. And I happened to come in on the middle of this. And as I was just taking all of this in, I happened to notice the screen that it was about a lifeguard talking about his job. And I made that announcement. I said, I think he's trying to signal that lifeguards swim. I said something to that effect. And then it all kind of set, settled in for this teacher, and she understood. And I think the important thing was in that moment, trying to be extra protective for the child, trying to ensure the child's safety. She might have forgotten in that one moment that nonverbal does not mean non-communicative. And it was really important to kind of reconfirm that our children who are nonverbal does not mean they are non-communicative. They do communicate in other ways. And it was important to kind of point that out to her. If you could hit the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you again. I really appreciate this. So neurodiversity in a nutshell, and you'll see this in a nutshell slide that I have, because I feel as an educator, we learn so much. There's so much information that we're processing all the time. We are constant learners as educators and teachers. However, sometimes I feel that if I can't apply something in the moment, if I don't have it handy in the moment, it really does me no good in my day-to-day activity. So I like to think of certain things that I can take with me that I can apply right in that moment in the course of my day. And so just basically this thought about neurodiversity is this. It's a wide spectrum. Uh, Famous saying is, if you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism. They don't present the same. Not every situation is the same. And this sense of to think about differences, not deficits. There are both strengths and challenges for our children on the spectrum, for all of our neurodiverse children. And I think it's really important to switch that lens from different, not deficit. And I think that's just a really important way to kind of look at children through that paradigm. We all have unique strengths and we all have unique challenges. And to think of that as educators is really important in helping to create that harmonious classroom. Lastly, I think we all need, I know for myself, to have a wider view of what's normal. There are things and moments with my son, with students, where my perception of what should be isn't necessarily the correct one. And so I'm constantly trying to work on expanding my sense, my perception of what's normal, because everyone is truly unique in that sense. Beline, could you hit the slide, please? So this is the CDC, Center for Disease Control's definition for autism spectrum disorder. It's a developmental disability that can cause significant social, communication, and behavioral challenges. I highlighted a few words there that I think are super important to remember. Developmental, which means it changes over time. Things improve over time. So in speaking with parents, speaking with educators, really important to realize that things are improving. The speed of which they do, the pace may be different than my expectations, but things do improve over time. And also, autism affects social communication and behavioral challenges, not cognitive ones. So I see a lot of times educators will think that it has to do simply with cognitive challenges, and it really has to do with these social interactions, communication, a lot of social emotional learning, which I'll talk about later, and behavior. These are the things that we address. Just like if a child is struggling with reading, we break down the components of reading and look at that. And for autism spectrum disorder, the components that we're looking at to support are social, communication, and behavioral. Beline, if you can hit the slide again, thank you. So, so excited that Temple Grandin was one of the keynote speaker, or the keynote speaker, and just an amazing woman. One of her quotes that I love: "Autism is not a disability; it's a different ability." And I'm sure for those who attended her talk this morning, you probably learned a lot about her and opinions. So I won't go too much, but just an amazing woman and always inspiring to me. Next slide. So this is my simple definition. I saw this picture a long time ago, and when I saw it, I said, "That's my son. That's my son," because there are moments that he is capable of such amazing, amazing things that just leave me in awe. And there are other moments that I am so frustrated, and sometimes they can go hand in hand. And when I try to advocate for the autism community with teachers, with educators, with parents, I try to talk about that sense of dual. Like there are amazing gifts, just like there are amazing challenges. Next slide, Helene. Thank you. Um, I won't get into too many facts. I'm sure you've heard a lot of facts about autism. So the only two that I wanted to talk about are these two right here. Um, so 49% of children with autism engage in elopement behavior. So think about that. The story that I told earlier about the young boy scaling the fence, that's not a one in a, oh, that doesn't happen. That happens at a school that I used to work at as a gen ed teacher. We had to several times. I would hear the principal. They would have to. This child would run out onto literally, and it was a school here in LA on a busy street, and out that child would go racing out the front door. So this is a real challenge that we want to work on creating these safe, harmonious classrooms so our children, our students feel safe. The other percentage, the other fact that I want to point is 178% increase in autism diagnoses since the year 2000. That's incredible. And what I tell educators who sometimes, when I'm addressing, say, teaching staffs, uh, sometimes an educator might think, well, that's for a resource teacher, or a special ed teacher, or an autism core teacher. Those facts don't address me. And what I always tell those educators is if you don't have a student with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, in your gen ed classroom this year, the chances are that next year you will, because it's 1 in 54 children. So it's important that all educators understand and learn more about autism and how to support our ASD learners. Next slide, Beline, please. So, what does autism look like? Well, autism can look like a lot of different things. Autism can look like children curious about learning, children happy. There's no one thing that autism looks like. It's really important that autism can look a myriad of different things. Next slide, Beline. Autism also looks like this. You may have seen Susan Boyle. I think my slide got cut off. Susan Boyle, the singer that was on one of the singing shows, Daryl Hannah. Some historians believe Thomas Jefferson had autism. Uh, Historians point to the fact that Franklin knew Jefferson liked to work alone, that he was good with language, and that he wasn't interested in socializing with all the other patriots in Philadelphia when they were meeting in Philadelphia. So he said, let me hand this to him. He can focus on this. Of course, some of the other people, Tesla, Andy Warhol, Sir Anthony Hopkins, Steve Jobs, Einstein, who did not speak until I believe he was, I think, 6 or 8. I don't want to quote and be wrong. Lewis Carroll. The gentleman in the middle is the first Division I scholarship athlete. He plays basketball for Kent State. I've seen him on ESPN. It's really amazing to see how far we've come in working with, supporting our autism community. So I just am inspired and think how different the world would be without all of these people's contributions. Next slide, please, Beline. Some of the reasons for these successes have to do with the strengths. So our students with autism spectrum disorder, our ASD students, have many strengths that sometimes aren't talked about. The first is the unique sense of humor. And I want to point out that these strengths sometimes can present as challenges, right? So the unique sense of humor, someone like a Dan Aykroyd, right? Maybe as a child, that's the child who is maybe seemingly disruptive or whatnot. The honesty. I know for my son, my wife has learned never to ask my son what her new haircut looks like or dress, because he will be quite honest and blunt. And because of that honesty, these are the children that sometimes will get in trouble on the yard with yard aides because they lack guile. So the children who know how to talk themselves out of situations, it's usually our ASD students who get in trouble because they'll be quite honest about what's occurred on the playground. I'm going to talk about desire to connect in a little bit. They are detail oriented, they are focused, they have great memories. It all depends on if their intelligence and a special interest is being tapped. And I'm going to talk about some experiences that I've had with children who've been able to really demonstrate their strengths in these areas once their special interests were tapped into and focused on. Because with the honesty, our children on the spectrum won't engage for the sense of appropriateness or what's expected of them. They don't, I know my son and most students I work with don't work that way. That sense of what you should do really doesn't matter. It's about what's logical or what's interesting them. They are very fair and just. Very fair and just. I've seen that. And then lastly, this desire to connect. What I have seen is that a general assumption about our children on the spectrum is, oh, they don't want to connect. Oh, they just want to, and I don't think that's true. I think a lot of our children on the spectrum have a great desire to connect. They simply don't, like a child would have a great desire to read but may lack certain skills. It's the same thing with our children on the spectrum. There's a great desire to connect. They simply lack some of the skills needed to do so. Things like turn taking, perspective taking. So these are skills that we can teach on the yard and in non-structured class time. Beline, could you hit the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So autism can also look like this, right? Frustration, detachment, lack of engagement, sensory overload, which I'll talk about. So this is the other side of autism. Our children on the spectrum are very sensitive to a lot of different sensory inputs. And while I may be able to talk to you and I can hear some car outside, or maybe my dog scratching at the door, or my son playing video games, or whatever's going on, hopefully I can focus and prioritize what's going on here and put my focus here. For some children, that's very difficult to do. So these are the other things that we want to be looking for when we're working with our children on the spectrum, and for all children. Next slide, Beline, please. And here are some of the reasons why these challenges are common for our ASD students. I want you, before I address them, just to think of a thermostat. So we all have this kind of cognitive thermostat that allows us to regulate sensory input, emotions, anxiety, attention, and impulse. So there's seven different facets to attention. Impulse control, anxiety, all of these things are regulated inside. And we do things, neurotypical people do things to regulate these impulses, anxieties, emotions, sensory input. And our children on the spectrum, these are the challenges they have. So the hidden curriculum of school, right? Understanding pragmatics, understanding how to advocate for myself in a way that's healthy and beneficial, right? That flexible thinking, being able to see 2 points of view, very difficult. The central coherence, like what's the big picture? Um, I'm thinking of my older brother, who happens to be on the spectrum as well, and that sense of being able to see the forest for the trees, right? So our children on the spectrum can focus on certain minutia, okay, but they can't see the big picture. So if I have a disagreement with someone, I'm just going to argue. If I have a disagreement with my friend, say, I'm going to argue my point so comprehensively, so strongly, that in the effects of that is that I lose my friendship with that person. I haven't developed the ability to be flexible. I haven't developed the ability to advocate for myself. Executive functioning. I am sure you see our children on the spectrum. They lose things. They can't find things. Their desk is a mess. There are so many things that go on that we're processing all the time. And what's important to remember is when we are, and I'm going to address the scientific reason why, when we are anxious, executive functioning, our central coherence, all of these things that happen in our frontal lobe just shut down. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So when you're thinking about your student or other children on the spectrum, and or children with anxiety, which I will address because that is a prevalent fact about our young children today. all of these challenges come up. A lot of them have to do with the inability to regulate our sensory input, our anxiety, our emotions, our attention, impulses. All of these things that we learn to regulate, our little children, our little students, they are learning. Some of them have great challenges in this matter. Next slide, please, Beline. So in addressing, when I talk to teachers, we're all busy, right? We have so much to do. We have testing and lesson planning and classroom management, 8 million things a teacher has to do. And so, and I know sometimes as a teacher, I would sit in a staff meeting and I'd be like, okay, just give me the core point. What's the core point? Because I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. And so when teachers ask, what's the thing? Beline, hit the slide. And I did all these slides about what the thing is, thinking I was going to be cute, hit these buttons. Now, asking Beline to do is probably a bother. Sorry, Beline. So, the thing is, Beline, hit the slide, the big reveal. Find a way to get from here to here. That's it. That's it. If you take anything from this presentation today, please know the best thing you can do for any child who's in sensory overload, who is melting down, who's having a hard time, help support them in getting to calm. And I was on a schoolyard once, and there was a boy clearly struggling with a lot of things, and the yard aide, who was very nice and trying to help him, she kept saying so-and-so to his name. So-and-so, why are you doing this? So-and-so, you're such a nice boy. So-and-so, why are you doing this? And I sometimes I speak up, and maybe I should or shouldn't. I don't know. But I said, I said, if he could tell you that, he probably wouldn't be doing it. And from then, what was great, what came out of that was I realized, like, oh, I can start talking to yard aid staffs about some of these things. And it was great to go around to yard aid staffs to help share some of these things. Because in the moment of sensory overload, our whole frontal lobe shuts down. If you'd seen me talking to Beline 5 minutes before you entered this meeting, you would have seen, and I can feel the flop sweat coming down my forehead and everything else, but you would have seen a man scrambling in sheer panic because I couldn't share this. And Beline very calmly was talking me through it. I couldn't hear, I felt like I was underwater. I couldn't hear anything. So the only thing that we can do in those moments for our children is keep them safe, keep our entire classroom safe, and help our children who are struggling get to a place of calm. And then we can talk about how we address certain things. But we can't address those things in the moment, and I'm going to talk about that as well. Next slide, Beline. And I might have to speed up because I realize I'm going. This is just a little fact about depression, anxiety, behavior disorders. And so basically for our elementary students, you're looking at 2 out of 30 students are dealing with these struggles. So we can't say it's other classrooms. You know, every classroom is going to have a child or two that's struggling. So we need to all kind of take part in this. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry, I'm going to probably have to speed up because I think I've talked a lot about certain things. This is a story about receipts and executive functioning. This had to do with my son. We were going to a birthday party. Just quickly, we bought the boy's gift and a card, and we're coming out of Walgreens, and my son was talking about numbers, and he couldn't understand how 0.50 isn't bigger than 5, and I was trying to explain dollars and cents, and he was getting really frustrated, and he couldn't let it go. And all I could see was, oh, this party isn't going to happen. My son is going to melt down here in this Walgreens parking lot. And in just a sense of sheer panic and urgency, I said, look, son, look, I'm going to write this down. And I had the receipt in my hand, and I just scribbled talk about 0.50 and numbers. And the minute I wrote that down, my son became calm. And it was almost like, if you look at a computer, right? A computer has a hard drive and it has random access memory. That much I know about technology. And the hard drive is far greater than the RAM. Sometimes that RAM gets overloaded. And so a child can't process all of these things. So sometimes acting like the RAM, like, hey, let me write this down. And I actually did this in a classroom for a child who the teacher was like, I haven't switched to my October calendar. This child is driving me crazy. I'm going to do it. I just have it in a second. And we literally, I said, why don't we write this down? Yellow sticky, put it. And as soon as we did, that child felt a sense of calm. It was handled. And then they could move on to the next thing, because that ability to shift focus, prioritize, those are all executive challenges, executive functioning challenges. Next slide, Beline. Behavior is communication. That's a nutshell right there. When you see behavior that you don't like, that is a communication. And to take it as such, take that as a communication, not as a child acting out, but rather a child who simply hasn't learned to self-advocate in an effective, healthy way. Next slide, Blean, and I'm going to speed up because I'm looking at the time, and the one thing I always try to tell teachers is there's a difference between tantrums and meltdowns. A meltdown is dysregulated and it's not going towards something, it's actually trying to escape from something. Whereas a tantrum is going towards getting something. A child has a tantrum because they want to get something or they're not getting what they want. A meltdown is to escape a situation that's causing a lot of anxiety and sensory overload. Next slide, Blean. Thank you so much, and I apologize if I'm going too fast. I'm not going to do these because I don't have time, but these are great ways to help a child calm. So I don't know if the people on the presentation today know about Headspace. It's a great app. They offered it free to educators. It has great meditations, all these amazing things. And in my classroom, every classroom I've ever had, when I visit with teachers, I talk about this sense of how do we self-regulate? How do we teach self-regulation to children, right? And so there's a lot of ways to teach it. And I also feel that if a teacher can self-regulate, right, and all the stress that we have, we can help model that for our students. And these are two types of breathing exercises that are so simple and quick. You can do the box method of breathing, the flower. I think I'm going to show it later. A flower and a candle. Breathe like you're smelling in a flower. Breathe out like you're blowing out a tiny candle. The bunny breathing is 3 quick, short, 1 long. Snake is a long, and then long exhale. There's a couple of breathing techniques that are really great to do with our children. Next slide, Billeen. And I apologize for going fast.
I just wanted to remind you we do have until 12:30.
Oh,
So you have some time.
okay. Woo. All right, I'm gonna wipe my flop sweat off my brow because I was getting stressed for time. Thank you, Billeen. Thank you so much. Okay, so that's a little bit about knowledge and understanding. I want to talk about the supportive environments, and I'm going to start off with a student story. If you could hit the next slide, Billeen. In my job when I first started, I was only going to gen ed classrooms. Oh, I saw Gnoodle. Yeah, it's awesome. And I invite everyone to check the chat. Some educators have been sharing some amazing stuff, and definitely invite everyone to check out the chat because there's great stuff going back and forth. So I didn't visit autism core classrooms, starting out just gen ed, and then I started to visit some. And I happened to visit a classroom. They were side by side, 2 autism core classrooms, K through 3, 4, 5, 6, I think it was, or 1, 2, 3, 4. So split up early and older elementary. And in the younger group, there was a boy there when I would come in, and I am not kidding you, every single day racing. When I say racing, I mean full speed back and forth. If the door was open, he would race into the other classroom, circle that room, come right back out. This would go on nonstop. And there was actually a long-term sub there who was really overwhelmed, trying to do anything she could. It was really kind of, and I really had no things to offer, except I came in one day to help out, and the first thing I wanted to do was kind of fix up the classroom so there was more space. There was a lot of clutter in the classroom. I said, let me see if I can help with that to remove some of the clutter. Maybe that will help with the anxiety. And I came across that little tube. I don't even know what they're called, those little yard tubes, the little crawly tubes. And this child liked the Jaws theme. That was the one thing that this child would slow down for, to play the Jaws theme, and then he would put his ear to the iPad and listen to the JAWS theme. That was kind of like a self-regulating technique that he kind of came up with. When I brought out that tube, what was so interesting was the child dashed right into it and then calmed down. It was amazing. It was just one of those like serendipitous moments like, oh my goodness, what's this? And he would sit in that classroom in the tube and he would be calm. And I remember sometimes I would come in, I would hum the JAWS theme, and that was like a moment of connection. This was a child that was nonverbal, and he could be in there, and there could be a dialogue, if you will, inside the tube. He felt safe in this confined space. And it was really amazing because once a child feels safe, then learning can occur. And for this child, this was a way of really making him feel safe. So our environment is so important and so fundamental to learning. Next slide, Beline. So this is my belief as an educator. It's not anything proven or just my belief. I think, and not to talk badly about any standardized testing or everything else. I understand all those things are important and Dibble scores and standardized test score. I get it, all that stuff, right? But I believe the most important thing in the classroom is slow, safe, and seen. And they don't show up on any testing score, but they are more helpful to student learning, I believe, than anything else. I think when our children feel safe, when the classroom is going at a slow pace, when we're not rushed, that we have to get so many things done, and when our children feel seen, they feel more safe. And this is the kind of learning environment that we want to have. I should say I want to have, and I invite teachers to think about that because all the pressure that when I was in a classroom, I looked at myself as I have to be the stopgap from whatever the monarchy of higher is pushing down on me. How can I filter that so that stress doesn't come onto my children? And some of the things that I always tried to do is, I mean, I'm sure you've heard it, extra time, right? Giving extra time so our students don't feel rushed. I would prep every single transition. I'm not kidding. In the morning when I greeted students in the line, I would say what's coming up. When I picked them up from when we went out to recess, when I picked them up from recess, when we would go to the auditorium, I would prep about what we're going to see and how can we behave in the auditorium and how can we show everyone, what a great classroom we are. Every opportunity to prep what is coming helps our children feel safe, especially for our ASD students. I am a big believer, and I'll talk about the visual supports. I think having like a little schedule on children's desk that need that sense of like what's happening next. Who doesn't want to know? I'm going to talk about that because I think sometimes as an adult, I can forget like, oh yeah, I feel so much better when I know what's coming down the tubes. And like I said, it was so great to be in a state of panic this morning because it brings it home like, yes, that's not a good feeling. So how can I prep transitions? One of the things that I was always big about in my classroom is greeting children at the door. Like it's a chance, like, yeah, right? It takes up some of our learning time, but that's learning time to greet our children at the door so they get to kind of connect with their teacher, right? They feel better. The teacher sees them, they get to feel seen. I think that's big. I was always really big on routines too. We all lesson plan, and I was big on like it's the each week the way the schedule is going to go is going to be the same. There'll be no last minute try not to have last minute changes because that makes I know it makes me feel safe when I know what to expect. I have a routine in the morning when I get up, and that consistency. I'm looking like I'm here in my kitchen, just and I bought this fancy green screen to make it look professional, but you can still see my kitchen behind me. So doing the best I can to present. But uh, here in my morning, I have some reading and I journal and I do whatever I need to do to have my routine in the morning so I can start my day. And it's important that children have their routines. Slow down, Alan. That's a good thing for you to do right now. Slow down. So I try to slow down in the classroom. One of the things I was always big on is in the morning after backpacks went away and all that. I'm thinking of a classroom that was near the track, and we would just we would just take a walk around the track, and I wrote it up as PE time. It was like some of our PE time, and that little morning walk just once took about 10 minutes. And it was just great. It was just great that the children could connect, and it was just really helpful. And it was also physical activity. So just some ways to slow down, for children to feel safe, to feel seen, and all the academic things that we are all striving, and that the administration is, I know numbers, it's so important, numbers, but those numbers will happen almost magically, not magically, but they'll happen a lot easier if we have our children feeling safe, if we can go at a pace that's reasonable, that they feel seen. So anyway, so that's my soapbox. I'll get off of that. Beline, could you hit the next slide, please? So here's a little trivia question. How many senses are there? So I was going to do a whole thing and have people chat in, but if you want to take a guess, oh, someone already guessed it. So you guys, everyone knows, like boom, 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 it's 7, right? Beline hit the slide. So wasn't that big of a trivia question. I just saw 7 pop up like 100 times just now. So yeah, so I'll just talk about the 2 that aren't talked about much. We all know the 5 senses, and they're great to be writing about, but 7 is my lucky number. Awesome, Joseph. It's 7. I think of Ray Bork. I'm from Boston. Ray Bork, hockey player. Anyway, Phil Esposito too. That shows how old I am. Proprioceptic and vestibular dysfunction, right? So these are 2 senses that are really important for our ASD learners, right? And when I talk to preschool teachers and early first start, we see some of these things, right? Walking on tiptoes, grasping things too tightly, that poor balance, accident prone, right? Seeking and bumping and crashing. This is huge. When my son is a senior in high school right now, and when he was in middle school, those were real struggles then. And I could always tell when he had a particularly rough day, because I would come into his room and he has a weighted blanket. It's like a 20-pound beanbag blanket that gives that kind of really good proprioceptic stimulation. And he would be under that weighted blanket, and he would literally be pushing his face like really strongly up against the bedroom wall, just seeking that proprioceptic stimulation, because that's what we're doing with our sensory input, right? We're either evading or seeking. And so it's important to know if a child is seeking sensory input or trying to escape from too much. And so that was a good signal for me in those moments. I knew just to give him some space, let him know that I was there, obviously. Challenges with movement directions, right? Okay, let's do this, let's do this. These directions come, and our children, like I've already said that twice, but some of our children really struggle with that. For vestibular, yeah, these are children, for lack of a better word, they might seem clumsy. Their posture isn't presenting in a good way. They don't like being tilted backwards. They may have no fear of heights. The spinning, right? That's stimming. And just a quick word, when I talk to parents about stimming, one of my greatest moments of shame was when my son was in elementary school. I tried to stop him from stimming because I didn't understand, like, everyone stims. It just some ways are more socially acceptable or less obtrusive, right? So my son would do flapping his hands, and I would try to get him to stop. Every time he did it, I would get him to stop. Unfortunately, in junior high, that had to go somewhere, and he started biting his nails, like to the nub. And that's one of my like moments as a dad where I was like, wow, really wasn't understanding. So I always talk to parents about stimming is fine, right? It could be expressing really good emotions or stressful ones, but it's just an expression of emotion. These vestibular dysfunction also with some of our speech delays and emotional insecurity. So these are some of the ways that they present. But these 2 senses, and I'm going to talk a little bit how to kind of provide some stimulation in these areas. I'll talk about that as well. Next slide, please, Beline. So sensory overload, we talk about it, and I know our resources teachers know about it, and I'm sure it's so talked about now, everyone knows. So all these things like heat, right? Sound. My son did not want when we would go back east to visit, you couldn't hug my son. He doesn't like being, still to this day, does not like he doesn't like that touch. It feels too much for him. Smells, right? All of these things, bumping into people. And I want to take a second, next slide, Beline, to talk about two areas that our children on the spectrum really have. These are the challenging areas, right? The playground and the lunch area. So, okay, why are they challenging? Because there's no structure. If there's no structure, we don't know what to expect. If we don't know what to expect, there's a lot of anxiety. I love this quote. Everything is coming at me at once, but it seems I'm the only one noticing. That's what's going on in our playground and lunch area. There's just so much sensory stimulation. It can be overwhelming. Next slide, Beline. So I always ask educators just to take a moment, right, to think about your lunchroom, your lunch area, your playground, your play area, right? Next slide, Beline. To really think about that and ask yourself, what does it sound like, feel like at your beach? Because these are the areas that can cause a lot of challenge, create a lot of challenges for our students with ASD. Next slide, Beline. So environmental supports. A lot of these, again, and it's just kind of a review of something. So I apologize if you're like, well, Alan, I already have heard this, but just feel it's worth sharing. So Beline, could hit the next slide. I'm just going to talk about some basic supports, maybe talk a little bit about why. So yeah, visual cues, so important, right? We can prompt in a lot of different ways. We can physical prompt, right, to point to things. Obviously, oral prompting, right? Visual prompts are really, really effective. Okay, they can show us how does our body look when we're listening, right? What to do. I love these first then charts because that's really executive functioning, right? If I do this first, then I can do that. That's executive functioning in a visual representation. I included some. You can see the brush teeth, then school clothes. That my son is 17, and that's still on our bathroom mirror. And the one down the bottom, listen to that. I've kept that. That's in a notebook that I have because he wrote that, I think, when he was like 10 or 11. So I to remind myself that he's improving and he's growing. So all these visual cues are so important. Beline, next slide. And this is the scientific reason why. This is really backs up this whole thing. When we hear visual prompts, right? Visual cues, we think, oh yeah, sure, it's a good thing. But no, there's scientific reason for this. So in the neurotypical brain, you can see the ability to process what is heard, the ability to process what is seen. They're pretty equal. They're pretty visually, you can see they look about the same. But look at the atypical, the neurodiverse brain, right? The ability to process what is seen is 10 times more powerful. So when you're wondering, geez, I just asked that student 3 times to do this. I gave the instructions. I've checked for, because auditory is being heard. Your instructions, your directions are being heard. They're just not being processed as effectively. So that's the important thing to remember, is that these auditory cues and instructions, they're just not being processed as effectively as visual cues. So just something to think about. Next slide, Beline. And of course, I talked about routines, right? I think it's so important to have your classroom schedule. Sometimes to have a desk schedule for some of your children who really struggle with this, because it helps us feel safe. When I know what's coming up next, I feel safe. And I just, I put in sameness builds safety. In those moments when sameness isn't going to occur, such as earthquake drill, fire drill, special assembly in the auditorium, whatever these things that are kind of like new to the schedule, I think it's so important to give our children that heads up. I know I want that heads up. I want to know, wait, whoa, whoa, I want to know what's coming down the pike. I want to know what's happening, because if I don't, then I'm going to feel stressed. I'm going to feel nervous. Beline would agree with that. Beline, could you, thank you. Sensory supports. Sensory supports, right? So you can see a couple that, now, I just want to speak about trampoline. For ourselves too. Absolutely, Viviana. Absolutely. Um, I know trampolines. I know in LUSD that's something that there's some real safety issues around that, and I don't know if they're allowed in certain classrooms. But I talk to parents about that if they have one and it's safe and it has the guardrail. That is a real great vestibular stimulation. Um, the like the bouncing up and down. I don't know why, but it's a great vestibular stimulation. The same with bubbles and like all of these tactile inputs like Play-Doh, silly putty. They're really amazing. You can see there's like that little pup tent there behind the bookshelf. Every class I go to, every single classroom I go to, that's one of the first things I ask or suggest. Like, where's your little cool down area? It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but to have a place, and there's real actual reasons why we need to have this dedicated space. However small it may be, it's super important to have some kind of cool down area in our classroom. It's one of the most important sensory supports, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Um, Beline, could you hit the next slide, please? Vestibular stimulation, right? The trampoline, sit and spins are amazing. I don't know what that little horsey, the little bouncy horsey is called, but those are really great. And then the push carts, these are all great uh, uh, for vestibular stimulation. Next slide. And this is for proprioceptic. So bubbles are amazing, Play-Doh, the kinetic sand, all of these things are amazing tools. Next slide, Beline. So a sensory room, right? These are some things you can think about when you're creating a sensory room, but it doesn't have to be this large. Just some dedicated area. And the reason why, Belinda, if you could hit the next slide, it is really important. Okay, it teaches self-regulation, auditory, visual, tactile processing, provides a private space. That's what I want to talk about. So our children on the spectrum really struggle self-regulating in the interaction, in the event. It's very hard to recalibrate, self-regulate in the event. Really what I have seen is our children on the spectrum, and maybe all children, neurodiverse, definitely need to be like, have to remove themselves from that so they can self-regulate. That's why this sensory room is so great a place that's quiet. And I always would tell teachers, I think if a child needs to go to sensory rooms to self-regulate, I never put a time limit on it, because there's no learning going on when a child is anxious. So why not let a child self-regulate so they can come back to learning? So these regulation rooms can support sensory seeking or avoiding, as I talk about, because we're seeking sensory input or we're trying to evade or get away from too much. Next slide, Beline, please. I know for preschools, I would see this a lot, these sensory kits, but I think all grades in elementary can really benefit from having a little sensory kit. That can have some things from home, a favorite stuffed animal. I know some children, the weighted vests, fidget toys are very popular, and I think they're great. I think as teachers, talking and learning how to use a fidget toy so it doesn't become just a toy. Um, Therapies, Play-Doh, all of these things are really great. Family photos, just anything that helps support that sense of safety, I think is great. So sensory kits are huge. Next slide, Helene. Okay, so nurturing relationships. Next slide, Blaine. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so we know these qualities, right? All these qualities that we want to have as teachers for all of our students, right? Flexibility, to be organized, to be consistent, to be perceptive, empathetic, willing to ask for help. All of these qualities are important to think about, and to remember no one is perfect. Like, we're all working towards these. This is an ongoing, just like our children are growing, we're growing as educators. Um, the jobs we have as educators are so challenging, and to be kind to ourselves and to keep looking at these areas of growth. Believe, next slide, please. The first child I ever, okay, there it is, sorry. The first child I ever supported in a role as a social emotional learning facilitator was this little boy in kindergarten. He was really struggling, and he was being sent to the resource room pretty much all day long because he wasn't doing any, I guess from his teacher, he wasn't doing any work, he wasn't communicating, and all he was doing was, like what she said, was playing with these crayons. When I came into the resource room, I noticed that he was kind of, they were all broken little pieces of crayon. It seemed like he was arranging them or rearranging them, and I had no clue what to offer. I had no clue, and so I gave that response of I'm going to talk to my peers and come back with some information, which is what I was taught to say when I don't know. And that day I left the school, and as I'm driving along, I stopped for lunch, and I was going to this burger place, and there was a CVS right next door, and it just hit me like, oh, those crayons, that big box of crayons. If I can't come up with something good, maybe I could just get a nice box of crayons. Maybe that would help. And so I bought this box of crayons, and I came back to the school just because I felt like I don't know what to do, but I want to be kind. I want to help however I can. And so I came back to the resource room, and child was still there, and he said, "Hey, I got you these crayons." And he started to read them. He started to read the different colors. I can't tell you how amazed I was. And we were all like, it was amazing to see. And he just started reading crayons, and he could read, and it was incredible. And then we started to work with his kindergarten teacher about all of the lessons, the counting lessons, the adding lessons, the printing practice lessons. All of them became about the crayons, right? We leveraged that special interest, and it was like a different student, and it was amazing. And it was not because of any special knowledge. It was just like, as educators, right, we care about our children. We're always trying to figure out things, how to support them, and sometimes something will hit us, and it's just like, wow, that's amazing. So yeah, that was something I just stumbled upon, but it always reminds me, like, just keep trying, just kind of keep trying. So yeah, so that's why I shared that. Next slide, please, Beline. Okay, so basically, this is I got this from a parenting class that I took when my son was younger, and I was really struggling, and I've kept it with me since. Connection before correction. So I just want to talk about our children on the spectrum. Uh, There's 6,487 things I could correct my 17-year-old son on in a day. I can't even, oh my goodness, right? And there's certain children in class that I see things like, oh, I'd love to help. Let me suggest this. Let me suggest this. I've got to remind myself as an educator and as a parent, let me connect first. Let me connect with that child first. Because if I can connect with them, then maybe I can do something to help and instruct. But if I'm always just correcting, I've seen it firsthand, people. My son, uh, as a parent, I've been punched, I've been hit, I've certainly haven't been listened to. And I'm going to share a story at the end that really just opened my eyes about this sense of connection. So I can't say it strongly enough. As a parent and as an educator, we have to connect before we correct. And if you can, these nutshell, if you can share that, because I've seen it out in schoolyards. I've seen many well-meaning educators with good things to say, just that maybe if they could be said second, and if that connection could happen first. So just something to think about. Next slide, Beline. Yeah, when I work with yard aides, I shared this earlier. Jackson, you know better. Jude, what's wrong? Miguel, come back here. In that moment of overload, all of these things aren't working. because the child is in sensory overload, is in meltdown, is in anxiety. So they're not being processed. So we have to work on getting them to feel safe first. Next slide, Beline. Just gonna try to also get back to my presentation. So the reason for this is what is called the amygdala hijack. This is an actual term. You might have heard of it. Where I learned it's from my son's neurologist. When he talked about this and presented it as such, this sense of amygdala hijacking the child, right? So our frontal lobe, right? And I'm not a scientist, so excuse if I, present this in non-scientific terms, but this this frontal lobe, this frontal cortex is like our personal assistant telling us what to do at all times. See that person? They're waving, you wave back. Oh, that person's smiling, smile back. Oh, that person's sad, ask them, how they're doing. I remember my son when he was little, he used to walk by and, Dad, I want to have a play date with so and so. I'm like, dude, he's right there. Go say hi to him. I don't want to say hi. Why say hi? I want to have a play date with him tomorrow. And he couldn't understand like these pennies, right? Pennies in a bank, and you say hello, and you build up that relationship. But the amygdala hijack, literally, what happens is in a moment of anxiety, our children's brains, literally, the amygdala shuts down the frontal cortex, literally shuts it down, rewires so that all impulses are going to the amygdala. And again, this was told to me, so it's not like I'm some scientist. The amygdala is like a walnut-sized part of our brain in the back. It's the caveman brain. It's the fight or flight brain. It told cavemen like dinosaur, run. Oh, the other caveman is taking my meat, hit him and take the meat back. And I know that dinosaurs run around a caveman, but you get the analogy. Um, so this amygdala hijack takes over, and then it's just fight or flight. It's just fight or flight. So we really have to really work on getting a child back to calm. And hit the next slide, please, Beline. Which brings us back to just find a way to get from here to here. That's it. That's what we all have to realize is our number one priority in that moment. Next slide, Beline. I don't know if this fits, but it was something that happened right before pandemic, actually, right before we went to online learning. I was in a school, and this wasn't a child or teacher that I was working with. So again, just take it with a grain of salt. But he was struggling. He was really, really struggling. I think he was either a second or third grade student, and he was having a hard moment. And I don't know why, and I don't even know if this was the most efficient thing or effective thing to do, but I noticed his shirt. I know my son, when he was younger, loved dinosaurs. So he would have a million dinosaur shirts, just a million. And I took this chance and I asked this student, I said, do you think Batman could beat up Superman? And he said, yes, if he had kryptonite, he could. And we got into this little conversation about kryptonite and Batman and Superman. And it was just this, again, a special interest that, and I, who knows? Maybe if I had said the child wasn't a Batman fan, probably wouldn't have worked. But he happened to be a Batman fan. I got maybe lucky, and it worked. So once again, like those special interests, can we leverage those to support our children? Next slide, Beline. So the first thing we want to think about is how can we remove certain triggers, right? ABA analysts, they look at that, right? Antecedent behavior, actions, and so we want to kind of learn our students and what are those triggers, right? And then we want to redirect students, and then obviously safety first. Um, so I think about it as helped, prompt, and wait, depending on where a child is. If a child is struggling but still like not in that overload sense, you can offer to help. Like, would you like a drink of water, Sam? Would you like to sit in the shade here with me? If a child is having real struggles and in a moment of like starting to get overwhelmed or overload, it's always might be helpful to prompt a child like, hey, so and so, can you come walk with me over here to line? Or hey, can you come talk to me over here for a second? But if a child is in a state of overwhelm and overload, as I've been saying throughout this whole talk, there's really nothing to be done in those real intense moments. Basically, just to let the child know you're here, you're there to help them, keep them safe, keep other children safe, and just let them know you're here. Next slide, Beline. Um, some things to understand. Understand the circumstances around their upset. Listen for their most important feelings. It's good to label their feelings, right? My wife is a preschool teacher. I noticed when our child was young, it's something that I was like, oh, that's great. She would really label these actions with some feelings. It looks like you're really frustrated. It looks like you're sad right now. And to give these actions a feeling and a label, and that helps our children, right, in social emotional learning. um, Always important to make at least 3 empathy statements. I have a friend who is not a teacher who I said, I'm stealing this. His name's Ben. I'm going to steal this, because if I ever talk to him about something, he always says, geez, that sounds really hard. And I don't know if he thinks that or not, but I always feel better when he says that. um, and I'm running out of time, so I won't tell another story. So repeat steps 3 and 4 if necessary. Next slide, Beline. I know you go to 12:30, so I'm going to try to. I apologize. I talk a lot. Giving choice. Next slide. Can be stressful. So a great way to might say this is, instead of you could either do this or that, maybe give them a sense of, I'm thinking there's a whole bunch of different ways we can do this. Like maybe we can, walk to the nurse's office, or maybe you and I can take a moment here to see if you can feel a little bit better, or maybe we can go outside, to give a couple of options, because that either or causes more anxiety. So it's always good to give a couple of choices. When you have 2 choices, you have a dilemma. Next slide, Beline. And I apologize, everyone, if I'm going fast. I'm just looking at the time. So catch your breath, right? And approaching a child, make sure you're calm. Accept their negative feelings. That's a communication. Give a label to their emotions and model some coping skills, like those breathing practices. Next slide, Beline. And I apologize, everyone. I can send this out if. Um, so, yes.
Alan, just 1 second. I do see questions about the presentation.
Okay.
I will upload it to the session page on the attendee hub after the session has ended.
Oh, okay.
So you will be able to go back to the attendee hub, to the session page, and then just refresh that page, and the presentation will be available to download at the bottom.
Okay. And you know what I'm going to do also, just in case I run out of time, Alan, and in case people can't see, teachthespectrum.com. I've just put my email. If anyone wants to reach out, if they want to see a copy of these slides or anything like that, I'm always happy to help in any way possible. Just on recovery, when a child is self-regulated, no lectures when they return to the classroom or the group. Try to maintain the routine, maybe even go for some high-interest activities. Obviously, communicate with the parent, the guardian, the team afterwards. But the biggest thing is try to make challenge-free re-entry into group. Next slide, Beline, and I apologize. I'm going to speed up because I can see the time. Lastly, some social emotional practices. Next slide, Beline. Social emotional learning, right? I think just now our schools are realizing this is really important. Self-management, self-awareness, social awareness, right? All of these things are so important. And we're just now relationship skills. I read somewhere they said the most important factors for career success is not IQ, but EQ. And it's funny, my wife always says, well, you're the brains, I'm the heart. And I agree with her, because I'm still trying to grow my EQ. And these are the factors for success, right? All the academics we're teaching are important, but really, if a child can't have self-management, self-awareness, right, relationship skills, social awareness, responsible decision making, they're going to struggle. So social emotional learning is like so important. Um, and how, next slide, Beline, and you can hit the next slide as well. So how does it support? Builds empathy. It supports relationship. It helps bridge that connection between heart and mind. Okay. all important things. And basically it promotes our harmonious classroom. I'm going to go through these a little quick, Beline, because these are just kind of informative slides. If you want to hit the next one, emotional literacy, right? Mind-body connection, labeling our emotions, teaching self-management, learning how to express our feelings. I can send this to people. I apologize. I can just see the time, 12:26. Next slide, Beline. This is a great book. I highly recommend it. The Incredible 5-Point Scale. You can see right there if you want to take a slide shot. I won't spend time reading off a slideshow. Next slide, Beline. These are great, right? We want to have some awareness around our emotions. We want to help our students name their emotions, give it a label. We want to have empathy for what they're feeling and then come up with a solution. And a solution could simply be take some time to quiet our body, do a little breathing. How can we come up with a solution? Next slide, Beline. I apologize, everyone. I know I'm speaking quickly now. That 5-point scale can be used in so many ways. Like our children on the spectrum don't have pragmatics, or I should say they struggle with pragmatics, right? So we don't understand that the recess voice is not the same voice we use in the library, or our yard voice isn't the same voice we use in the movie theater, right? Voice modulation, identifying emotions, right? The size of a problem is a activity to do with children to understand, like, is this a problem that I can solve on my own, or do I need to go to a teacher or another professional? So this kind of sense of the 5-point scale helps give our children a sense of scale in their life. Next slide, Beline. I apologize. I know I'm going fast. Just some ways to express emotions. You can see these are great tools. Next slide, Beline. I was going to be cute and show you how I built my social emotional communication skill. Next slide, Beline. Yeah, just paper cups, happy face, sad face. But if you want to be really fancy and have a 3-point emotional scale, next slide, Beline. You can add a third cup. Okay, that was me being cute, and I don't have the time to be cute, so I'll just move on. Next slide, Beline. Starfish Story. This is what I talked about before, right? As teachers, right? That's we want to realize that that sense of anxiety is prevalent in everyone. And the example I use is if you go to a party, like if your staff has a big Thanksgiving party or teacher staff party, and a fellow educator drives you to that party, you're going to be in a state of anxiety because you don't have any control. So if you want to leave and your peer wants to stay, you're going to be frustrated. If you want to stay, but your peer needs to go and you don't have any other rides, you're going to be frustrated. You're going to be anxious. So having that sensory regulation area that our child can go to, I would just have this index card. It was red and green. And when it was turned to red, that was a child telling me, Mr. Amy, I need to take some time. And I would let them go to the sensory room. And people would say, geez, how long do they get? I said, as long as they need. Because if they're not calm, they're not learning. So let's just kind of focus on calm. So that was just a sense about driving to the party. Next slide, Beline. Okay, social stories, they're great. Next slide. I'm sorry because I have a minute, and I will send this slideshow to anyone who wants it. Here's some instructions on how to make one. Next slide, Beline. I apologize for my speed right now. And another story that's about a social story. Next slide, Beline. I apologize, everyone. I put in a lot more than I realized. Calming exercise, breathing in, flowers and candles is another one I could show you. It's easy, but next slide, Beline. This is a great video. If you want to take a screenshot, it's on breath and breathing. Great 4-minute video for children. Next slide, Beline. So that's kind of what we covered. Next slide, Beline. I love this quote. So-called mild autism doesn't mean one experiences autism mildly. It means you experience their autism mildly. You may not know how hard they are working to get to the level they are, and as a parent, I can tell you that is so spot on. Some questions are like, 1 thing I can change my learning environment, 2 things I can explore further, 3 peers I can share this with. Next slide, Beline. Another great video. I would take a screenshot of this. Amazing video on autism. Great slide. Great video. Next slide. This is a story about my son. I wish I could tell it. I don't have the time. Next slide. And yeah, Even God has autistic moments. That's why the planets spin. And so you can reach out to me at alan@teachthespectrum.com. That's my family. There's my son, Thomas, right there, who's now taller than me. And so grateful to be here today, everyone. I'm sorry that I had to rush, but I really appreciate you coming and listening. And if I can do anything to help you in your classroom or resource room, please let me know. I'm happy to help in any way possible. Thank you, everyone. And I guess I don't have, do we have time for questions? Believe me, we probably don't, huh?
Well, so the attendees are now going into a break
Okay.
time, and I can stick around for a few minutes. I
Okay.
do have to. I support a session in the next time slot, so I can't
Okay.
stay a
Well,
very
I just
high
want to say,
time.
Beline, thank you to you because you were amazing. Thank you for juggling all of this. I'm sorry that I wasn't better technologically, but thank you so
That's
much.
totally okay, and that's why I'm here. So I'm glad I was of help.
Okay. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, happy to answer them or reach out to me either or.
And I'll remind everybody that I'm going to upload the presentation on GitHub
Okay.
now.
Awesome.
So they'll be able to get it from the session page on the attendee hub. When you
Oh,
open
awesome.
the session, scroll past the description, scroll past the presenter bio, and it's going to be at the bottom.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure.
I don't see any